All right, well, this week we are in part 3 of a series called Make Believe. If you're new here, we like to take our messages and clump them into a series, kind of like how on TV, there's episodes and a series and a show. We like to do the same thing with our messages that have a common theme. We clump them together. And so the question we've been asking is, how do you make yourself believe? Over the past few weeks, I've asked you, no matter where you are on your faith journey, whether you've been in church forever and you love it and you think it's the best thing in the world, or maybe you were dragged here and someone threatened you, right, because you're going to lunch after or whatever, right? And you're like, I'm just not into this. No matter where you are, just picture what your life would be like with great faith. Faith, like confidence that there is someone up there who cares about you. We say confidence that God is who he says he is, and that he'll do what he says he'll do. Just imagine what life would be like. Imagine how you would face difficulty. Imagine how you would face challenges, bad news, difficult phone calls, right? Just imagine how, and I'm not talking about the kind of faith where you look back at an unfortunate circumstance and be like, oh yeah, okay, I could kind of see how maybe God was doing something in that situation. But in the fire, right? In the heat. To have the kind of faith that is unshakable, right? Or maybe we're swinging for the fences here, right? So what if we don't say great unshakable faith? But what if you could have faith just 10% stronger than where you are right now? And so the question is, how, right? How do you make yourself believe? If faith is confidence, if faith is trust, you can't just muster it up. If you don't trust someone, you can't just be like, all right, let me just really try to trust, right? Or really try to have faith. But sometimes this is the advice we're given, where it's well, you just gotta have faith. You just gotta trust. You just gotta believe. It's yeah, I'm trying, but it's just not quite working for me, right? It's just not there. You can't create something that isn't. Trust, faith has to be built. And so what we've been talking about here are something we call the 5 faith catalysts. A catalyst is something that starts a change, right? So these are 5 things we believe that help your faith to grow. We didn't make these things up, but what we have found is that if you are a person of faith and someone asks you hey, name something that has helped your faith to grow, everything that you mentioned will fall into one of these 5 categories. And if this is how it's working, then maybe we could look at these 5 things and be a little bit more intentional about weaving them into our lives. They're practical things you can look for and plug in that go beyond the whole idea of just praying, just reading your Bible and hoping that you're going to wake up one day with more faith. Really, really practical things. So last week, we talked about something called Providential Relationships. We said if you ask someone about their faith story, in almost everyone's story, there's this person, right? Or that girl, or that boy, or a teacher. I had someone I bumped in, and they played a role in the development of my faith. If I look at the timeline of my life and I pull them out of it, my faith is not where it is today. And it seems like those people were put there. And so we talked about how you need people and people need you. We talked about the early church and community, this idea of fellowship, which really is community, right? It's doing life together. And so then we talked about groups and how we could be more intentional about looking for those relationships. It's a big thing. It's an important thing. So that's number 1, providential relationships. Today, we're talking about our second faith catalyst. But before we jump into it, important question. Does anybody remember Sports Plus? Anybody? Yes. All right, a little love from the balcony. Sports Plus. Sports Plus was the greatest place in the world. I don't know what happened to it. They went out of business. It was more plus than it was sports. But they had everything you could possibly imagine. They had motion theaters, they had ice skating, they had a bowling alley, they had bumper cars, they had arcade games that were always broken, and not broken you can't play them, but broken they just won't stop spitting out tickets. So you can take those tickets and then just go cash them in at the little ticket center where you can get, bubble gum and the big whatever. And then you've got that one friend that saves his tickets for like 12 years and buys the PlayStation 2. And so like Sports Plus was just amazing. They had a rock wall. Amazing. It like had everything you could ask for. It was like the diner of childhood entertainment. Everything. They have everything you can think of, right? So I remember one time I was at Sports Plus. It was at a birthday party, which was a common thing. A lot of people had their birthday parties at Sports Plus, and it gets to the time in the party where the whole gang goes on the bumper cars, and so we're waiting in line, and everyone's trash talking online until finally that moment of glory. They open the little silver fence and let you run out and pick your car. And we all run out, and I get into the car, and I'm trying to buckle myself in, and there's that weird, awkward, double seatbelt, which is kind of fuzzy and smells because everyone's worn it, And height was not really ever a thing for me, so my foot was always just getting there, and the seatbelt's holding me back. And I'm just pumped, and I'm ready to just try and cream my friends, right? And so then you see the super enthusiastic person who monitors the thing that sits by the thing with the key and the button, and they're like, "Are you ready?" Okay. And then they press the button, and I remember I'm in, right? And I'm ready, and it's I don't remember which birthday party this was, but I remember this feeling distinctly, right? Where I'm like, here we go. He presses the button, everybody takes off, but I'm like, mine won't go, and there I am just stranded like a sitting duck while these people come flying in and are just whatever, of course, end up in the corner. But I'm trying to get the person's attention over there who's not paying attention, doesn't really care. And I'm like, my thing is not doing what everybody else is doing. Mine is broke, and everybody else's seems to be working great for them. Everyone's just gliding around, bumping into each other, but mine's not, and I'm stuck. Can you relate to that feeling, right? You ever felt like that? Maybe it wasn't bumper cars. Maybe it was, because that happens a lot. Or maybe it was someplace else. Have you ever felt that way about your faith? Where, you're trying to get through life, and it seems like maybe yours isn't taking off like everybody else's is, or at least other people's are. I remember having conversations with people that would just be I was just so stressed. I was so anxious. I was so worried. And then I stopped and I was like, you know what? God is in control. And then all my anxiety went away. I'm like, wow, that is great for you. It's mine doesn't do that, and then I'll try and be okay, God is in control, and nope, the anxiety's still there. Or I've heard people say things I used to be an angry person, but then I gave God all my anger, and he took it. I'm like, well, that sounds good for you, but mine doesn't do that. Just literally last night, we ordered takeout, we had ramen. I don't remember which restaurant it was from, but it's good. It's noodles. And I've got 2 little kids, so it's always a scene trying to get dinner set up. They're climbing on the table, putting their hands in the bags, touching everything. And we're just sit down so we can eat. I'm starving. My wife is sitting across the table. My daughter's right here. Finally, we get everybody settled down. It's okay, great, we can eat now, right? And immediately, my daughter just takes the ramen and dumps it on her lap. And it's all over her, and I'm like, okay, all right. And I'm remaining calm. It's the dog comes under the table. It's just dripping all over her, and she smells gross. And we're trying to clean it up, and finally it gets cleaned up, and I get right back in front of my little bowl. It was last night. And I'm okay, finally my turn to eat. And I set her up again with whatever remains, and she sits there and she's spills it again. And I'm for crying out loud, are you serious? I'm trying to keep it together here. And so when I hear people that are oh yeah, I gave God all my anger. Could you send him mine? I asked him to take it, but I think he forgot some. Maybe you've been in that position, right? Where you're looking and it's everybody else's or some other people's are working and yours isn't. Or maybe you're someone who's not a faith person. Right? Maybe you were dragged here and this isn't your thing. But even you, if you step back and you look around, I bet you could point out some people where you're you know what? Their faith, it's doing something for them. It really is. And then there's other people where it's not. It's useless for them. I like them better without it. And so what's the difference? What's the difference? Today, the faith catalyst that we're talking about, this is something that will help your faith to grow, but it also is a huge, huge difference maker in terms of whether your faith works or is useless. Useless, and that's not my word. So, we are looking at a letter that was written by James. Now, James was the brother of Jesus. I think I've said this before, but that is a tough gig, right? Why can't you be more like Jesus, James? So James writes this letter, and James believes that Jesus really is who he said he is. And James's letter, it's short, and it's insanely practical. Crazy practical. It's one of my favorite letters in the New Testament. Here's what he says. Ready? He says, do not merely listen to the word. Maybe you're thinking, what word? This word means message, right? Teaching. The things that Jesus said and the things that the followers of Jesus were now teaching. Don't just listen, merely listen, and so deceive yourselves. We'll get back to that in a minute. But he says, but do what it says. Do it. Put it into action. Practice it. The faith catalyst that we're talking about today is what we call practical teaching. Practical teaching. If you talk to people of faith, and you ask them okay, what's one thing that increased your faith? They might mention a providential relationship like we talked about last week, or they might mention practical teaching. There was a time, and this is what it'll sound like. There was a time in my life where for the first time, somebody opened up the things that Jesus said and they made sense to me. And I did it and I saw a change. This stuff, even though it was written 2,000 years ago, always heard about it, always knew about the Bible. I went to a place where I maybe recited some of those things. I might have even had some of them memorized, right? But I never actually tried to do it. And when it was presented to me in a way that I could do it, my faith grew. Practical teaching. We would define practical teaching as information that leads to application. Information that you can do. And so there's two parties here of this setup, right? There's the teaching party, which might be, maybe it's a book that you read, maybe it's here, coming to church, right? For us, we are really, really big on teaching to application. You will probably never hear someone up here just dish out information for the sake of information, right? We will always try to put handles on the lesson so we can take it and we can do something with it. And when you do, if you do, you'll see that your faith will grow. The other responsibility in this little setup is obviously the responsibility of the listener. And this is kind of what James is getting at here. He's don't just listen to it, but do it. And when you do it, you'll see that there was something to it. Your faith will actually grow from this. And so he kind of goes a little bit more into an explanation here, right? Kind of sets things up for us, helps us to understand the concept a little bit. Here's what he says, right? He goes on, he says, anyone who listens to the word, the teaching, but does not do what it says. Now pause here for a second, okay? This is but if you don't. This is an if you don't statement. Now, most of the time, especially if you're new to church, when you think of do this, and if you don't, what do you expect after that? Some kind of threat, some kind of punishment. If you don't, God's not going to like you. If you don't, you're bad luck. If you don't, things aren't going to go well for you. But James, this is why I love James, so practical. So there's no threat here. This is not about your value as a person, right? He says, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror. Interesting setup here. He says, and after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. A little metaphor. He's making a point here. Now think about this, okay? This probably won't take too long. But what good is a mirror or looking into a mirror if you've got some, schmutz on your face and you walk over to the mirror and you're oh, cool. And you walk away and just forget that, what good is it? It's no good. It's no good. Like, this isn't the most elaborate, creative metaphor here, but maybe he was in a room when he was writing with a mirror in it. But he's making the point, like, you know what? It's like if you listen and you don't do it, it's like you bought the shirt, but you didn't wear it. You cooked the meal, but you didn't eat it. You typed the text, but you never sent it. Like, whatever, you can make up your own illustration. He's like, it doesn't do anything for you. His point is, if you don't use it, it's useless. Or we could say, if it won't do anything for you if you don't do anything with it. Like, what he's saying is, you will get nothing out of it if you don't try to put this into practice. Now, maybe you're thinking like, okay, like really does that need to be said? You know, it's kind of obvious. It's like, why would I read a recipe if I wasn't going to cook a meal? You know, if you read a recipe, at the bottom of the recipe, it doesn't say, and make sure you do this, right? What he's addressing here, what James is addressing, is this tendency that we have, specifically people that have been in the church for a while, to be content with information. Like, acquiring information often scratches the itch, right? It makes us feel like we checked the church box. Okay, I heard it. That was really good. I never heard the story told that way. Very interesting. And then we move on. And what James is saying here is like, you will get nothing out of it if the goal of reading, the goal of listening, if the goal is simply to acquire information, you won't get anything out of it. So in the church world, in case you didn't know this, it's pretty common to get feedback from people. Sometimes it's in the form of complaints, which is fine. We love to hear what people think, right? And typically the things that are a little bit more public get a little bit more feedback. And so often I will hear, and other pastor friends of mine, they go through the same thing where they hear people give them, some feedback or some criticism or complaining. You can call it whatever you want, right? Here's what's interesting. Like I said, we welcome that. Really, really. I would love to hear if you have something to say about this. What's interesting, though, is that the complaint is almost never about application and almost always about information. It's like, well, I really would have liked it if you went more into this story and you talked about the geography and who was serving as king at that time. Can we go a little bit more into the original language? And it's just more like a hunger for more and more information, which is good, which is interesting, which I studied. I find very interesting. But for the purpose of what we're doing here, in a teaching where we're in a setting where we're trying to incorporate practical teaching, I really don't think it matters, like these facts, this information really doesn't matter unless it leads you to application, right? So if we're talking about the geography, and I'm going to tell you like, oh, this city was actually 60 miles away from this city. That really doesn't matter unless maybe you've got a guy who traveled those 60 miles on foot in one day because he had something to say. Maybe that would say something about how important it was what he had to say. You see what I mean? Like we have this hunger for information, but not necessarily for application. One time, I remember somebody came up to me and like, let's say the message was about greed. It wasn't, but let's say it was. She came up to me and she's like, I just need to know how else, like I needed more. I needed like, how else can I incorporate this into my life? Because I'm wrestling with this and I'm trying to get through it and I needed more. And I was like, you needed more application. And it was like the cloud, I heard angels singing. Because it's like, here's someone who is trying to get as much out of this as possible for the sake of application. Think about this, all right? Why is it that sometimes people who have been in the church for 10, 20, 30 years, like every single week, and sometimes several times a week, talking about things like patience, love, selflessness, like peace, joy, every single week. Why is it that like after 20, 30 years, like those people are not always the most patient, loving, generous, amazing people that you've ever met. Like, why is it? Have you ever thought about that? What's interesting is that this is not just true in the church. This is true like in every field of study. It's the same reason, think about this. It's the same reason why you don't become an amazing driver after you've driven for 10, 20, 30 years. If you've been driving for a few decades, my guess is that you're probably not much better than you were 10 years earlier, even though you may have driven every single day. Like, we tend to think the more we do something, the better we'll be at it. But that's actually not true. I read this book recently. It's called Peak. It's why the people who are the best in the world are the best at what they're the best at, right? And it goes a little bit into, like, you know, what happens in the brain and how people are thinking and the science behind it. And what he says is that typically what happens is when someone gets into a new environment where they're given new information, there is this steep improvement immediately because there is a hunger to learn. There's a hunger to get to a level that's acceptable, right? But then he said, typically it reaches a point of acceptable, what he calls acceptable behavior. And then you get there and you're like, all right, I'm pretty good, right? So it's like 16 and 17, learning how to drive. I need that freedom. I want to be able to go to the movies. I want to be able to pick up my boyfriend or my girlfriend. Like, it's like, I want to know. I got to figure out how to do parallel park so I can pass my road test. There's this deep sense of urgency. And it's like, okay, I think I'm fine. And for most people, you probably don't get that much better at driving for the next 40 or 50 years, right? This is the story in the church. And you know this, if you're new to church, like if you've only been here for a couple weeks, maybe, and I've spoken to some of you, maybe you're like, holy cow, like I have never heard biblical information from Jesus, from the Bible, presented in a way that I could actually apply. I'm doing it, and I'm seeing it, right? But then what often happens is you reach a point where you're like, all right, I feel like I'm like one of these people. And then we just stay. We just stay here for a little while. I think this is what James is talking about when he says, remember in the first verse, he says, don't merely listen. He says, and so deceive yourself. I think this is what he's talking about. If you come in every single week and you just listen, all information, no application, eventually, do you know what happens? Eventually you start looking at the church and feeling like, this whole Christianity thing's just not doing much for me. Which it won't, right? Like if you don't do anything with it, it won't do anything for you, but you can deceive yourself. It's like, okay, little confession here. So I try to go to the gym on a somewhat regular basis. And when I wake up some mornings I just feel great, fantastic, like gonna go get it today, get my little headphones in, I'm gonna go work out. I go work out like really hard, I get hot, sweaty, great workout, gotta take a shower, and then I come to work and I'm like, wow, really spent my morning well, okay? Good feeling. Then there's other days I wake up, I'm just not really feeling it, Like maybe I had too much ice cream the night before or whatever, just not really in the mood. Well, confession, sometimes I'll wake up, I'll go to the gym, and then I go and sit in the sauna for like 10 or 15 minutes. Do you know what happens when you sit in the sauna for 10 or 15 minutes? You come out sweating, you're out of breath, and I'm like, wow. And I don't think too much about it because then I'll realize that I did nothing that day. But I walk out like, now I'm sweating, I gotta go take a shower and get ready for work. It's this process of self-deception, right? If this becomes a regular thing, eventually I'm gonna look at the gym and be like, this isn't doing anything for me. I'm not seeing a change. Like, why don't I look anyone at the kickoff last week, did you see the guy running the moon bounce? Did you see his arms? Yeah, I was a little afraid to talk to him. He was gigantic, right? Yeah, why don't I look like the moon bounce guy if I'm going to the gym? It's this process of self-deception. And that's what James is saying here. You just keep listening. You just keep taking it in, eventually, but you never do it. You're gonna be like, you know what? This didn't do anything for me. And unfortunately, we hear this in the church all the time. Like after 10 years, people will be like, I tried it, didn't do anything for me. I'm out. And what James is saying is a warning, like 2,000 years old, because people were doing it back then. It won't do anything for you if you don't do anything with it. But he gives us an alternative. Okay, and here's what he says. He says, but whoever looks intently. This word for look, it's one word, look intently. Remember he said look in a mirror? Now he's saying look intently. Two different words for look. This word for look intently literally means to put your body in an uncomfortable position so that you can see. It's this idea of really needing to see what's going on. Like I'm willing to get on the ground to look underneath or to poke my head underneath the bed to see, like with intention. With intention. He says, whoever looks with intention, intently into the perfect law that gives freedom. Now, this is an important distinction. This is like a part that you can't fall asleep for, right? The perfect law that gives freedom. When we're talking about doing, we're talking about growing your faith, right? What you can't hear when he's saying this, when we're talking about this, is this whole idea of like you have to work for God to like you. What he doesn't want his readers to hear is this weight of obedience and legalism, like you've got to check all the boxes, you've got to get it all right. That we've talked about this before, where it's like this heavy faith that nobody wants to be part of. He's like, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the things that Jesus said. We're talking about this way of life, this perfect way of life that will preserve your feeling of freedom. Something that's light, like how Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's like, this is what we're talking about. This is how people thrive. What Jesus called abundant life. This is not like you got to do this and you shouldn't do this. He said, if you look intently into what he really said, and this person continues in it, it means remain, abide, like hold on to. He says, not forgetting what they've heard, but doing it. You know what will happen? He says they will be blessed in what they do. Blessed. Now, blessed is one of those words that means so many things, it means nothing, right? You get blessed when you sneeze. You get blessed like when you meet somebody. Like, it can mean a million things. One time I went to a store, it's a Christian bookstore. I checked out. I bought what I needed to buy. And the cashier looked at me and she said, you wait right there. I'm going to get you a blessing. And I was like, is that a threat? What in the world? She came out with the CD. But really, that word, it just has come to mean anything. Okay? This word for blessing, we've talked about this, it's this idea of this deep sense of satisfaction. It's not just circumstantial happiness, it's a deep sense of like, this is good. This was a good thing. What he's saying here, this is not, and here's like, what I don't want, what I'm afraid of with honestly talking about this, is that you're gonna walk out feeling like you gotta try harder and perform better, or God's not gonna like you, or you're gonna like fall out of standing with him. This is not what he's saying. He's saying, if you want to see that God can be trusted, you take what he says and put it into practice, and you'll be glad you did. You'll be glad you did. But you have to put it into practice, or it doesn't do anything for you. So if you were here on week 1 of this make-believe series, we talked about faith, right? Belief. And I don't know if you remember, but we said like often we get it out of order. We present Christianity as obedience. Like, hey, welcome to our club. You got to do this or you're not okay with God, right? We come out with all these to-dos, these laws, commands, to-dos. And that's out of order, right? What we said is all of this, it starts with trust, with faith. You don't listen to somebody you don't trust. That's not a good idea. Remember the little metaphor, this is another like really profound metaphor, of a doctor. Remember I told you, like imagine you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you you don't have long to live because you need a kidney. But he says, but I'm gonna give you that kidney. And he donates his kidney to you. And then after the procedure, he gives you some pills. And he says, now I need you to take these pills. Are you gonna take the pills? Probably. Do you know why? Because, though this isn't a great metaphor, he has proven that he can be trusted. He has proven that he's in your corner. And this is how God operates. Like every time you see Jesus mentioned in the New Testament, like this phrase, in Christ, it's a reminder, like everything we do is a response to the fact that God has proven that he's in our corner. We're responding to him. Even in the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments, they start out with God saying, I'm the God who rescued you out of Egypt. He's saying like, you can trust me. I'm in this for you. I'm looking out for you. And so you start with trust, and then you have action, right? But today, like mixed message here, right? Now I'm saying, no. We're talking about growing your faith. You obey, and then that will lead to greater faith. so what's the deal here, right? Mixed messages? Okay, so let's go back to our doctor. He's been great so far. Imagine this guy gives you his kidney. He tells you to take these pills. He proves that you can trust him. And now you have to decide, am I going to listen to him? Probably you will. But what if you don't? What if there's a party that's like, I'm not sure. I don't know if I can. I don't know if he's really trustworthy. The best thing you can do when your faith is kind of there but struggling, the best thing you can do is act on it and say, okay, I might not be 100% there. Maybe I'm 50 or 60 or 40, but I'm going to act on that faith. And then what happens when you see that it worked? What happens when you see your body accepts the kidney? You see, we start with faith that leads to action, but when we act on this, even if it's little, when we act on that, do you know what it leads to? It leads to greater faith. When your body accepts the kidney, you're like, okay, I don't know why I doubted. He could be trusted, right? And this is the situation a lot of us are in. Maybe you're at home and you're in an argument with your spouse, and it's gotten to the point where the issue isn't the issue anymore, and it's just turning into a little boxing match where you throw insults at each other, and you got the line, you can drop it whenever you want, and it's just gonna crush him. Or it's just going to crush her, and you're going to win the argument, and it's going to feel good. And in the moment, you're like, okay, we're talking about being blessed. We're talking about being satisfied. I think this is going to really this is going to be the good thing. This is going to seal it for me. It's going to seal the deal. And there's part of it's oh, but I know this isn't what God would want me to do. And so there's a little internal battle. Should I trust him? Is this really what's best for me, or should I go my own? The best thing you can do is say, okay, maybe there's 30% of me that thinks that the best thing to do is to bite my tongue. I'll do it. And you watch and wait, and then look back. And I think you'll see, you may have just prevented things from going explosive. And you can apply this to other areas of your life where you're looking at it and you're okay, kinda I trust God, kinda I do. But I really don't want to. There's still a huge part of me that doesn't want to act. And so a lot of times we're well, no, I'm not gonna. If you want to see your faith to grow, what James is saying is go for it. And you'll be glad you did. There's a situation with Abraham, who's a famous Jewish person, this big story. Everyone who's reading the letter that James is writing, they know who Abraham is. And there's this famous verse. It says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, meaning he was made right with God when he believed. And James, anticipating people are going to argue with this verse and be no, it's all about faith. It's not about what you do. He says, okay, fine. Yes, Abraham did believe God. He believed God. But wasn't that belief shown by what he did? And then he says, when he went, because he had to do a really difficult thing, and I'm sure there was a little bit of a struggle, right? When he did that, then what happened? Here's how he says it. He says, you see that his faith and his actions were working together. And what happened when he acted? He says, his faith was made complete by what he did. It came to a greater sense of fullness. James might say he was blessed in what he did. He was glad that he took that step. And so here's where I want to wrap up, and then we'll get out of here. What is it for you where you're I kind of do, but I really don't? There's a little part of me that trusts, but not a big part of me. I really don't want to. Or maybe you're somebody who's not in church, not a typical church person. Maybe you're dragged here. And you wouldn't consider yourself a believer. James, what's interesting is James is actually not writing to those people. He's writing to people who have signed on, who are on board. He's writing to church people. So maybe you're just sitting here. You wouldn't consider yourself a follower of Jesus, and you're I'm just listening. That's fine, and we're glad you're here. We want to make space for people who are just here to listen, just here to make sure we're not crazy, right? That's important to us. And that's cool as long as you know it won't do anything for you if you don't do anything with it. You're in the gym, but you're just checking out the equipment, and that's fine. And so you're not going to walk out expecting to have, moon bounce arms. Or maybe maybe you've been in the church for a while. Maybe you're kind of on that plateau, right? Like there was the spike. Maybe it was 10 years ago. Maybe it was 5 years ago. Maybe it was 1 year ago. Maybe it was 20 years ago. But you're like, okay, if I'm honest, like maybe I haven't made that much progress. What's interesting, this guy, Anders Ericsson, who wrote the book Peak, he said the difference between people who plateau and people who don't is something called intentional practice or deliberate practice. I think it's the same idea as what James was saying when he says looks intently. Like this idea of deliberate practice is seeing where you are and then pushing yourself a little bit further. Like bringing yourself to what you're used to, what's comfortable, and trying to go a little bit further. And you're going to fail and you're going to come back. But he's like, but it's this constant, like, okay, normally if it's a sport, like normally I make this many shots, but now I gotta learn how to get to the next. And he's like, it's this constant trying to go a little further. It's this constant putting into practice. That will be the difference. And so what is it for you, especially if you're a follower of Jesus? Where you're like, if I'm honest, I've been struggling with this issue and it's been the same for 10 years. Like maybe it's worth being intentional, taking some deliberate steps to make a change. Not so that God will accept you. Not so that you'll prove you're valuable. Not to get a gold star on God's chore chart, but to see that he can be trusted. And what I think James would say, and what I would say, is if you do, you'll be blessed in what you do. You'll be glad you did. Let's pray together. God, thank you that you love us. Thank you that we don't have to work for your love. Thank you that you have shown us a way that is good. Would you give us the faith to take steps of faith? To push ourselves a little bit beyond our comfort zones. Not to earn your love, which does not change. Not to win your approval, but to see that you are good and that you care and that we can trust you and do the things that you tell us. Would you remind us when we are blessed in what we've done? We've listened to you and we've seen that you are good and that you care. In Jesus' name we pray.